It's considered to be the earliest high culture of Central America. Everybody's heard about the Aztecs.
In the basement of a genetics laboratory in Copenhagen, scientists were staring at data that made no sense. They had extracted ancient DNA from the bones of people buried in the heart of the Aztec Empire. People who built the most sophisticated civilization in the ancient Americas. People whose origins history claimed to know with certainty. What the DNA showed instead was a genetic signature so unexpected, so geographically impossible under the current model, that the lead researcher reportedly stopped the analysis and ran it again twice because the first results could not be right. Except it was. Hi, my name is Carlos and this is Reef Discovery. Who were the Aztecs? The official story. The Aztecs, more accurately called the Mexica, were a Nahuatl-speaking people who built one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. At their peak, their capital city Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a lake in central Mexico, was larger than any city in contemporary Europe. We are talking about a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people in the early 1500s, at a time when London had barely 50,000. The Aztecs had running water, botanical gardens, a complex legal system, mandatory education for all children regardless of gender, and a calendar system so precise it still impresses modern astronomers. But where did they come from? The official answer has always been reassuringly simple. The Mexica were one of several Nahuatl-speaking groups who migrated southward from a mythical homeland in the north called Aztlan, which means place of herons, sometime around the 12th or 13th century of the Common Era. They wandered for generations, the story goes, guided by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, until they received a divine sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent, which told them to stop and build. That image, by the way, is on the Mexican flag today. After arriving in the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica spent decades as a despised underclass, hired as mercenaries by more established city-states, marrying into local populations, and gradually accumulating political power. In 1325, they founded Tenochtitlan. By 1428, through a clever triple alliance with neighboring city-states, they began their explosive expansion into empire. In less than 100 years, they went from landless migrants to rulers of a tribute network that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. It is a remarkable story. It is also a story that archaeology and mainstream scholarship has largely accepted at face value because it matched the written records left by the Aztecs themselves and the accounts recorded by Spanish colonizers after the conquest in 1521. The genetic picture that scholars expected to find in Aztec remains was therefore straightforward. A population with deep roots in northern Mexico and the American Southwest. Genetic signatures consistent with the southern migration from populations already present in Mesoamerica for thousands of years. Some mixing with local Valley of Mexico populations as the Mexica integrated into existing societies. Clean, predictable, settled. Then, the DNA came back and nothing was clean or predictable anymore. The DNA study that broke everything. In 2022 and 2023, a consortium of geneticists from institutions including the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Copenhagen University, and several Mexican research universities published the results of the largest ancient genomic study ever conducted on pre-Columbian Mesoamerican populations. And I want to be clear about what they actually did, because the methodology matters enormously here. This was not a small study. This was not preliminary data. This was the real thing. The team extracted ancient DNA from the skeletal remains of 176 individuals buried at sites across central Mexico, including directly within the boundaries of what was once Tenochtitlan itself. These were not random samples scraped from the Aztec periphery. These were people buried at the geographic and political heart of the empire. Based on burial context, grave goods, and location, these were almost certainly Mexica themselves. If you wanted to know who the Aztecs really were, these were exactly the right bones to ask. Now, here is the problem. Extracting ancient DNA from tropical remains is, to put it bluntly, a nightmare. Unlike the dry desert conditions that preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls or the frozen Arctic environments that have yielded clean ancient genetic data from European populations, central Mexico is warm, humid, and biologically aggressive. Bacteria, fungi, and chemical processes attack DNA constantly. Most ancient DNA studies struggle to get anything usable from tropical remains older than a few centuries, let alone remains from an empire that collapsed 500 years ago. The team cracked this problem by focusing on one specific bone, the petrous bone. It sits just behind the ear canal and is the densest bone in the entire human skull. It exists essentially to protect the inner ear from the outside world. And as a completely unintentional side effect, it also protects DNA from the degradation that destroys genetic material in every other part of the body. Ancient DNA, researchers love this bone the way a detective loves a witness who actually remembers what they saw. It is frankly the only reason this study was possible at all. From these samples, the team sequenced whole genomes or high-coverage coverage partial genomes. That distinction matters. This was not the kind of shallow genetic scan that tells you someone was broadly Native American and sends you on your way. This was deep sequencing capable of revealing specific migration patterns, admixture events, and genetic relationships between populations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Going in, the team knew what they expected to find. The Aztlan migration narrative pointed north. The conventional model said the Mexica walked south from somewhere in the arid highlands of northern Mexico or the American Southwest, mixed with local Valley of Mexico populations, and built their empire. The genetic data everyone assumed would confirm this. Northern signatures dominant, local Mesoamerican ancestry, music underneath. The story closed. They ran the analysis. Then they ran it again because what came back did not match the story. It did not match the model. It did not match anything the conventional narrative had prepared them to see. And in a genetics laboratory, when your results are so unexpected that your first instinct is to check for errors, that is not a minor discrepancy. That is the ground shifting underneath everything you thought you knew. The results nobody predicted. Here is where I need you to pay close attention because this is where the story gets genuinely strange. The genomic analysis confirmed some of what scholars expected. The Mexica populations did show strong genetic continuity with other Mesoamerican groups. There were clear signatures connecting them to populations that had been in central Mexico for thousands of years, consistent with the long human prehistory of the region, going back at least 14,000 years to the first peopling of the Americas. But layered within that expected signal were three findings that nobody had predicted. The first finding involved a genetic component associated with coastal populations, specifically populations with genetic signatures pointing toward ancient groups that had lived along Pacific coastlines. Not inland, not the arid northern highlands where Aztlan was supposed to be located. Coastal. The genetic markers in question showed strongest affinity with skeletal remains from Pacific coastal sites in what is now Guerrero and Oaxaca, regions that Aztec migration narratives never mentioned. Regions that were, in some cases, hostile territories on the periphery of Aztec political control at the height of the empire. This matters because genetic ancestry does not lie the way written records can. If a significant portion of the Mexica genome traces back to ancient Pacific coastal populations, then the ancestors of the Aztecs spent a meaningful amount of time on or near that coast, not wandering through northern deserts. The second finding was even more unsettling. The analysis detected what geneticists call a ghost population signal, a genetic contribution from a group that does not correspond to any known ancient population in the existing archaeological database. Ghost populations are not supernatural, though I admit the name is perfect for this kind of story. They are populations whose DNA appears mathematically in later groups as an ancestral contribution, but whose own remains have never been found or sequenced. They existed, they contributed genetically to later populations, and then they disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. The ghost population signal in the Aztec genome was statistically robust. It was not noise. It was not contamination. It appeared consistently across multiple individuals from multiple burial sites, and it pointed, in terms of genetic characteristics, toward populations with deep ancient ancestry diverging from other American populations at a remarkably early date. We are potentially talking about a group that separated from the main genetic lineages of the Americas somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago, and then largely vanished, leaving their genetic fingerprint only in the people who would eventually become the Aztecs. Think about what that means. Buried in the DNA of the people who built Tenochtitlan is the genetic echo of a population we have never found. A population that may have been in the Americas since near the very beginning of human habitation on this continent. A population that mainstream archaeology has no name for, no site for, and no explanation for. The third finding involved a pattern of genetic diversity within the Mexica population that suggested not a single migration event as the Aztlan narrative implies, but multiple distinct waves of population movement converging in the Valley of Mexico over a period of centuries. The individuals buried at Tenochtitlan were not genetically homogeneous. They showed a diversity of ancestral profiles that spoke to a complex multi-source origin story, one that could not be reduced to a single group of people walking south from a single homeland following a divine eagle. The Aztecs were not who we thought they were. They were older, more complex, more geographically diverse in their origins, and they carried within their DNA the signature of people we have never identified. Now, let us talk about Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock's forbidden theory. If you have spent any time in the world of alternative history, or if you have watched his Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, you already know who Graham Hancock is, and you probably already have an opinion about him. That is fine. Hold on to it. We are going to test it. If you have never encountered him before, here is the short version. Graham Hancock is a British journalist and author who has spent roughly 30 years arguing across a series of best-selling books, including Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and America Before, that human civilization is significantly older than mainstream archaeology acknowledges. Not slightly significantly older, not a few centuries older, thousands of years older. His central thesis is this. Sometime around 10,800 years before the present, a cosmic catastrophe, specifically a series of comet impacts that triggered a period of rapid climate change known as this Younger Dryas, destroyed an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization that had achieved a level of sophistication we would find genuinely startling. A civilization that, in some respects, may have rivaled our own. This civilization did not leave behind cities or monuments that we have found and correctly identified. At least not yet, Hancock would say. What it left behind was survivors. A small group of educated, technically skilled people who scattered across the globe after the catastrophe, carrying with them accumulated knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and mathematics. Refugees, essentially, but refugees who knew things. And those people, Hancock argues, were the mysterious wise men and divine teachers described in the foundation myths of virtually every major ancient civilization on Earth. The bearded strangers who arrived from the sea. The gods who taught humanity how to farm, how to build, how to read the stars. Not gods at all, just the last educated people from a world that no longer existed. Mesoamerica is central to Hancock's argument, which is why this DNA study matters so much to his theory specifically. Graham Hancock is a British journalist and author who has spent roughly 30 years arguing across a series of best-selling books, including Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and America Before, that human civilization is significantly older than mainstream archaeology acknowledges. Not slightly older, not a few centuries older, thousands of years older. His central thesis is this. Sometime around 10,800 years before the present, a cosmic catastrophe, specifically a series of comet impacts that triggered a period of rapid climate change known as this Younger Dryas, destroyed an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization that had achieved a level of sophistication we would find genuinely startling. A civilization that, in some respects, may have rivaled our own. This civilization did not leave behind cities or monuments that we have found and correctly identified. At least not yet, Hancock would say. What it left behind was survivors. A small group of educated, technically skilled people who scattered across the globe after the catastrophe, carrying with them accumulated knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and mathematics. Refugees, essentially, but refugees who knew things. And those people, Hancock argues, were the mysterious wise men and divine teachers described in the foundation myths of virtually every major ancient civilization on Earth. The bearded strangers who arrived from the sea. The gods who taught humanity how to farm, how to build, how to read the stars. Not gods at all, just the last educated people from a world that no longer existed. Mesoamerica is central to Hancock's argument, which is why this DNA study matters so much to his theory specifically. And his reading of archaeological sites has a well-documented habit of emphasizing supporting details while quietly stepping around contradicting ones. These are legitimate criticisms. I am not here to tell you Graham Hancock has been right all along. What I am telling you is that this DNA study has made his theory significantly harder to dismiss with a straight face. And that is not the same thing, but it is not nothing either. Where the DNA and Hancock collide, let us go back to the three findings from the genomic study and look at them through Hancock's lens. Not because that proves his theory, but because the overlap is genuinely disturbing and deserves honest examination. The first finding, the Pacific coastal genetic signature in the Aztec genome, is interesting on its own, but it becomes dramatically more interesting when you consider what Hancock has argued for 30 years about ancient maritime civilizations. One of the core claims in America Before, published in 2019, is that the Americas were reached by seafaring peoples long before the conventionally accepted dates. Hancock cites genetic studies of certain South American indigenous populations showing unexpected genetic affinity with populations from Australia and Melanesia. Findings that mainstream geneticists have now largely confirmed and attributed to an ancient migration event that most scholars date to somewhere around 8,000 to 13,000 years ago. Coastal populations, ancient seafarers, people arriving from unexpected directions and leaving genetic traces in later civilizations. The Aztec DNA finding does not prove Hancock's specific theory, but it does demonstrate that the genetic history of Mesoamerican populations is considerably more complex and considerably more coastal in character than the standard migration from the North story acknowledges. That is not nothing. The second finding, the ghost population, is where things become genuinely uncomfortable for the mainstream position. Hancock has argued consistently that there was a population in the Americas, sophisticated, ancient, and now largely invisible in the archaeological record that predated and in some cases preceded the populations we normally credit with founding American civilizations. He has pointed to the genetic diversity of early American skeletal remains, including the controversial Kennewick man and similar ancient specimens, as evidence that the original peopling of the Americas was more complex and more varied than the single Bering Land Bridge migration story suggests. The ghost population detected in the Aztec genome is not Hancock's lost civilization. Let me be completely clear about that. It is an ancient American population indigenous to this continent, not a group of pale-skinned survivors from a drowned civilization in the Atlantic. But its existence demonstrates exactly the kind of hidden genetic complexity that Hancock music has been arguing for. There were people in the Americas before or alongside the populations that mainstream archaeology accounts for. People who left no monuments we have identified, no cities we have excavated, no written records we have decoded. People who existed, mattered, influenced later populations genetically, and then vanished from everything except the DNA of the Aztecs. If that does not make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, I don't know what to tell you. The third finding, the multiple distinct migration waves converging to form the Mexica, speaks directly to one of Hancock's longest-running arguments about the foundation myths of ancient civilizations. Hancock has always insisted that when ancient peoples describe their origins as involving the arrival of outsiders, teachers, civilizers, people who came from somewhere else and brought knowledge, we should not automatically dismiss this as pure invention. The Aztec origin story is not simple. It involves multiple groups, multiple migrations, divine guidance from deities who themselves arrived from mysterious origins. The genetic data now shows that the biological reality behind this origin story was also not simple. It was genuinely multiple, genuinely complex, genuinely pointing in directions that the tidy line narrative does not account for. None of this proves Graham Hancock right, but it does something almost as significant. It proves that the people who have been confidently telling us for decades that they have the Aztec origin story completely figured out were wrong. And if they were wrong about that, the question of what else they might be wrong about becomes considerably harder to avoid. The counterarguments, I promised you fairness. So, before we go any further down this rabbit hole, let us actually steelman the mainstream position. Because the scholars pushing back on Hancock-adjacent interpretations of this data are not simply being defensive or protecting their careers or circling the wagons around a crumbling consensus. Some of their objections are genuinely important, and if I do not give them to you honestly, I am doing the same thing I am accusing the mainstream of doing, telling you an incomplete story. So, here are the objections, the real ones, the ones that actually have weight. The first objection is methodological, and it is serious. Ancient DNA studies dealing with tropical remains are subject to contamination risks and statistical uncertainties that simply do not apply to better preserved samples from cold or dry environments. The Petrus bone technique is remarkable, but it is not magic. Degraded DNA means more room for error. More room for error means results that look clean inside one study's framework, but might not survive contact with independent replication. And here is the critical point. The ghost population signal, as statistically robust as the authors claim it is, has not yet been confirmed by an independent team working from independent samples. In ancient genomics, one study is a beginning. It is not a conclusion. The history of this field is littered with dramatic findings that turned out to be contamination artifacts or statistical ghosts that evaporated under scrutiny. That has not happened here yet, but it has not been ruled out either. The second objection is interpretive. The Pacific coastal genetic signature in the Aztec genome does not require a maritime civilization or mysterious outside contact to explain. Not even close, actually. Population movements within the Americas over tens of thousands of years are extraordinarily complex and still poorly understood. A coastal ancestry component in the Mexican genome could reflect ancient internal migrations that happened long before the Aztec Empire existed. It could reflect a mixture of ants between inland and coastal groups over millennia of normal human movement. It could represent patterns of prehistoric population flow that are entirely consistent with known models of American prehistory and simply have not been documented yet because we have barely sampled these populations genetically. Surprising does not mean inexplicable. It might just mean we have more work to do. The third objection is the most important, and I want you to actually sit with this one. The existence of genetic complexity in ancient populations is not by itself evidence for Hancock's specific claims. Ghost populations appear in ancient DNA studies conducted all over the world. They are a known phenomenon in population genetics. They represent gaps in our sampling, populations whose remains we have not yet found or sequenced, not necessarily mysterious advanced civilizations that vanished without trace. The ghost population in the Aztec genome is genuinely interesting. It absolutely demands further research. What it does not demand is that we accept Hancock's entire theoretical framework as the explanation. Dr. Jennifer Raff, a geneticist at the University of Kansas who has spent her career studying ancient American populations, has argued that the public tendency to leap from surprising genetic findings directly to lost civilization narratives does a real disservice to the actual complexity of indigenous American history. The Aztec story is fascinating and strange and deeply complicated entirely on its own terms, she argues, without needing catastrophes, survivors, or sunken continents to make it interesting. That is a fair point. It is an honest point. It deserves to be taken seriously and not dismissed just because it comes from the institutional side of the debate. But here is the thing, it still does not answer. If the mainstream had this figured out, why were they so wrong for so long? What this really means. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this study. We built an entire understanding of one of the greatest civilizations in human history on the basis of written records left by the Aztecs themselves and accounts recorded by the people who conquered and destroyed them. And those records, it turns out, told an incomplete story. Not necessarily a false story, but a story that left out entire populations, entire migrations, entire chapters of human movement and mixing that we are only now beginning to see because we finally have a tool, ancient genomics, that can read the biological truth written in human bone regardless of what any written source says. This is exactly what happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls. For 70 years, brilliant scholars built elaborate theories about who wrote those texts and where they came from using every traditional tool available. Then dust DNA from the parchment itself overturned the consensus in ways that none of the traditional methods could have predicted. The biological record told a story the written records had obscured. The same thing is happening here, except the implications are larger because the Aztecs are not the only ancient civilization whose origins we think we understand. If a genomic study of 176 individuals from the Aztec heartland can produce 3 major findings that contradict or complicate the established narrative, what would similar studies of Olmec remains show? What would the DNA from the builders of the earliest structures at Teotihuacan, a city so old that the Aztecs themselves did not know who built it and simply called it the place where men became gods, what would that DNA reveal? We do not know because we have not done those studies yet. Or if we have, the full results have not been published. And that silence, that gap, is itself a kind of answer. Graham Hancock's specific claims may or may not survive contact with the full weight of future evidence. His theory of a lost Atlantean civilization is still, as of the time I am making this video, a hypothesis without definitive physical proof. But the broader principle he has been arguing for 30 years, that the origins of civilization are older, more complex, and more globally interconnected than mainstream archaeology has been willing to acknowledge, that principle is looking less like fringe speculation with every major ancient DNA study that gets published. The Aztecs were not simply a band of northern migrants who got lucky. They were the end point of a genetic story stretching back at least 12,000 years, involving populations we have never identified, migrations we did not know occurred, and coastal connections that no written source preserved. They were, in the most literal biological sense, more mysterious than we knew. And the mystery is not shrinking. With every new study, every new sequence, every new ghost population detected in the genomes of ancient peoples, the mystery is growing. Jeremy Wade, of all people, once said he spent 9 seasons catching monsters in dark rivers, and at the end of it all, he said, the real monster was our refusal to look honestly at what was in the water. I think about that when I think about ancient history. As Bets, we have built comfortable stories about who the first great civilizations were and where they came from. Those stories are not lies exactly. They are just incomplete. And incomplete truths, as Wade understood, can be more dangerous than no answers at all because they make us stop asking questions. The DNA study does not tell us the Aztecs were founded by survivors of Atlantis. It does not confirm that Graham Hancock has been right all along. What it tells us is far more interesting than either of those things. It tells us that the biological reality of who these people were is richer, stranger, and more deeply rooted in mystery than anyone who claimed to have the answer actually knew. And here is the thing that really keeps me up at night. If we are this wrong about the Aztecs, a civilization that existed until 500 years ago, that left behind massive cities and thousands of written records and living descendants who carry their language and traditions to this day, if we are this wrong about them, imagine how wrong we might be about civilizations that ended 10,000 years ago and left us nothing but stone. The bones are speaking, the DNA is reading, and the story they are telling is one that nobody fully anticipated. If this kind of deep dive is what you come to rediscover for, then you already know what to do. And if this is your first time here, well, welcome to the dark water. I am Matthew, and I will see you in the next one.